Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to our non-Muslim guests who may be joining us. And you have come to another session of the Doctor's Lab with myself, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker, and my esteemed host in the left-hand corner, brother Dr. Khalid Green. Assalamu alaikum, brother Khalid.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hayyakum Allah. It's a pleasure to be back on the Doctor's Lab once again.
As always, mashallah. Today's session is going to be slightly shorter, viewers, because on my side in the UK, Maghrib prayer comes in a little under 40 minutes. However, we're going to probably readjust the time in the next fortnight, bringing it earlier so that Brother Khalid and I can continue that discourse we do for between an hour and an hour and a half, as we only come on every fortnight. So without further ado, Khalid, what I wanted to do is continue with the theme that we had. We started with Hijra, then we moved to the reverse Hijra, if you can call it that, returning to our lands of origin, resettling back in the West. And I think we had a really good discussion about that a fortnight ago. Now, I think moving on to what we are bringing back. You know, we discussed aspects of that the last time. What do we bring back? Those of us who have returned to the societies we come from, we herald from. And we're not just speaking from a student of knowledge perspective. We're talking ordinary lay people like myself, those who went out to work, experience a more religious, socio-religious experience. We've come back. Some see that, consider that a failure, as we mentioned previously, and just put their head down and disappear into the ether. However, I think we need to look at a perspective that not everyone is going to make Hijra. And those that travel for work are going to return, okay? And some may not travel at all. And we are experiencing, and we've been experiencing now in this era, the biggest populace of Muslims living outside a Muslim domain or society in the history of Islam. So Muslims in the West are here to stay. Okay, and we see a lot of Islamophobia and negativity that comes from the non-Muslim societies or populations, not all, but some having that Islamophobic fear. We've seen far-right propaganda, and we've seen terrorist attacks in view of that. New Zealand, Andre Breivik killing these individuals who were non-Muslim at that, but he held them to be very liberal. So we've seen this shift amongst some of the non-Muslim populace. But for us as the Muslims now, we need to really start rethinking and reviewing how do we return, or those of us who have not been able to travel, establish ourselves effectively in the West. Now, before I hand over to you, we're going to discuss masajid, schools, all sorts of institutions, movements and ideologies that can contribute towards that. I think one of the key things that we need to discuss as well as Salafis, proudly Salafis, is how we interact and engage with Muslim co-religionists of other ideologies, of other movements or delineation, should I say. And we're not speaking under this umbrella of Ikhwanism, Ikhwani Muslimin. I want to make that very, very clear. We're not speaking under that particular umbrella, because that's a call that they have, irrespective of ideology, of methodology, of whatever. We must all work together, whatever. There are conditions when we can do that, and I think we should discuss those. And there are those when we cannot. It is just impossible to do that from a creedal Aqidah perspective. I will use my framework, the cognitive development framework that I developed in my PhD, and this time, without applying it to individuals and their development, I want to apply it within a context of communities, what stages they are at in respect of that cognitive development model. And for those who are unsure, haven't been familiar with that framework that I've developed, is a 4-stage cognitive development framework, which is used in other conversion theories to different degrees. And the first one is the founding stage, that very basic founding stage, developmental stage of an individual, and we're going to, who's come to Islam, who has come back to the religion. The next stage is that youthful, also idealistic stage, but of activism and miscontextualization of at that stage of development. Then the third stage is the adult stage, which is more of a foundational, more of a contextualization stage as the individual is growing. Again, I want to juxtapose that and place that on a community context and setting. And the final phase is that mature phase of wisdom, knowledge, not only reflecting on development from the past, but being able to advise and navigate more emphatically in the future within a wider context. So Khalid is familiar with my framework. You cited it. I remember you told me, Khalid, throughout your PhD, so you're very familiar with the framework. I want to use that within a societal context as we speak about our communities, inshallah, and the Muslims in the West.
No. Yeah, it's a very useful framework. I see it more as it was applied to the individual. So it's a little bit hard for me to conceptualize perhaps on the societal scale. But at the same time, as Muslim minorities, we obviously grow and progress through stages. And I think that's kind of what's meant with the rebuilding progressive and resilient communities, that our communities, we're more established in the West now. We have greater numbers, and we are going and growing through stages. And I think one of the critical things is how to maintain our Islamic identity. And of course, there's different approaches that different communities take as far as individual communities. And then as far as even, I guess you might say, a sectarian approach, because as you mentioned, there's those progressive, so-called progressive Muslims who assimilate and just adopt everything of the West and what have you, and mostly at the expense of their actual religion and religious tenets and so forth. Then you have groups that are kind of, as you say, Ikhwan Muslimin orientated, which kind of have a political objective, and they as a group, as well as the progressives, take kind of I guess it's an inter-religious pluralism. I'm not sure how I would say that, but within the religion or inter-religion religious pluralism. So they're basically like, hey, we have different methodologies, different aqidah, different approaches in society. Let's put it all under one umbrella. It doesn't matter if you're Shia, you curse the Sahaba. It doesn't matter if you don't believe in the Sharia at all. It doesn't matter if this. It doesn't matter if you're LGBTQ. Let's just have a united front. So they have they subvert the religious differences, okay, in order to get their greater political objective. And then you have Salafis, and I would say even Deobandis. Deobandis also tend to be, and this might be an overgeneralization, but the ones that I've encountered, they tend to be very religious. What they share in common with Salafis is that they tend to not be as, those religious values are very important to them. So you'll see a lot of times the religious ones they have big beards. They're always in a shalwar kameez. They, alhamdulillah, a lot of them, they pray in the masjid a lot. They're very active. They're concerned about the deen. They, and also they're not as, similar to Salafis, they're not as engaged with the society. It seems to me that they're very insular, that they're just, hey, we're about maintaining our Islamic identity. Yes, we do some things. There's, some things to the greater community and so forth, but we're more concerned about maintaining our Islamic identity and values. And that's where Salafis in general kind of stand as well. So my point being is that there is a variety of different approaches that we find, and this is a part of the represents the different approaches that we take as Muslims in navigating being Muslim minorities in general, and more specifically in the West, because a Muslim minority in Ethiopia is quite different than a Muslim minority in America or the UK, because in Ethiopia, although maybe they're minority, it's almost like a Muslim country in certain places. You hear the adhan, you have whole Muslim villages and whole Muslim territories, tribes and so forth. So, it's still, even if they're a minority, it's a very different kind of pluralism and a different situation than we have in the West as total minorities.
No, okay, Khalid, for that. And I want, first of all, wa alaikum salam to Sister Sheree and Sister Zamzam, brothers and sisters who've come up. Good to see you here today. I want to make it clear, and I know you'll agree with me on that, Khalid. You've alluded to that there. When we talk about progressive, rebuilding progressive, we are not talking about the progressive of the vernacular and vocabulary that we see of some of those Muslims who are espousing extreme liberal views, LGBTQ being something that they're supporting and endorsing and everything like that, because that's unnecessary. And I will say that clearly. We do not have to subscribe to every cue and call that is antithetical to our beliefs. But in the same instance, in not subscribing to them, we are not condemning them and advocating violence. And I'd say condemning, and I'm putting those two together, because what we see is that the moment you show resistance or disagreement with any aspect of Western liberalism, then you are targeted and labeled as a bigot, and you want to see violence perpetrated and the non-existence of these. No. We're saying in the same way, we're under this democratic umbrella that the West subscribes to. If we want to adhere to a faith or a way of life that is not interfering or interrupting or threatening the overarching status quo, like we see with the Orthodox Jews, like we see with the Mormons in America, like we see with the Hare Christian movements and other socially conservative non-Muslim communities, then those of us within the Muslim faith who want to adhere to a particular social conservatism, like many Salafis do, like the Deobandis that Dr. Khalid has highlighted, then that existence or coexistence should not be a problem. It should be allowed. So I want to make it clear, when we're talking about progressive, we're not talking about progressive in that context. We're talking about a progressiveness as developmental for Muslims and the institutions that we want to build that are within the context of the societies that we are living in. But that both progressiveness, that developmental aspect that I'm referring to, must have intrinsic to it a resilience as well, because there are going to be elements societally that are going to be foisted upon Muslims, as we're seeing, that compulsion to subscribe to particular ideologies, particular ways of life that are not intrinsic to the democratic process in and of itself. People, non-Muslims, opt in or out, and Muslims should be able to in that instance as well. So when we refer to resilience alongside progressiveness, and that again, progressiveness being development of Muslim entities, institutions, individuals, these two must coincide. They are one in the same. They cannot be absent from each other in that regard. So this is what we mean in that instance. So Khalid, what I mean now, so transferring that framework context, as you've understood about the development of communities as we grow and we're in the West and everything. So for example, we see, I'll give Brixton as an example, and keep that question up by Hamad, please, Hassan. I'll come back to that before I hand over to Khalid again. When we look at my community initially as a young community in the 90s, that was at a very founding stage. We'd come to the Deen, many Salafis, we were Salafi, the elder community was not Salafi. We were there because it was Quran and Sunnah, it was an African Caribbean community, North African, we had Moroccans, and we saw Islam. We had a few white converts attending there as well, a few Asian brothers who were on the Sunnah. And it was a very formative stage of that community. So it was a founding stage. Okay, this is what I mean when I transfer the framework to the community side. You had that in Abu Muslima's community when he first started it. Okay, I know there are other examples. I can only remember that from the 90s. So they were at that first founding stage. And most of the knowledge that we were getting at that stage from the scholars, and when we were trying to implement, it was a very exciting time, was abstract, because we were hearing from scholars and we were hearing about a Deen and everything. So the dress would come through. All of us would be in thobes. The sisters would be in black abayas and niqab. We became more isolationist because we saw we were in a society that we felt and held to be not necessarily against us, but we had removed ourselves from the practices of that particular society. So we were at that formative stage. And the abstract understanding that we had, while it was very rudimentary, it would have to change as we progressed, and in order to develop and proceed and traverse and navigate through society. So that was the initial stage, that what I speak about from that founding stage as you place it to a community. But I'm going to move on quickly on one point before I hand over to you. While a community may be at that founding stage, or even one of the later stages, we then need to look at the composite structure. Who makes up those communities? And you may have the younger brothers and Muslims like we were, and younger sisters who'd come in, who were at that founding stage of our deen, as well as the community being at that founding stage. But you had elders who'd come from different climes from America and settled there, from the West Indies or whatever, and they were maybe at the next youthful stage. They may have been at the adult stage. They may have been at the final mature stage because of their life experiences. So these dynamics are interesting in that, what do we do in that instance? Does the energy of the young dominate how that community moves forward? Or do we have a combination of the two, the drive of the young at that very founding stage, but them being receptive to understanding the context of how to practice the deen from the elders who are at the more advanced stages individually of development in their lives and in their deen? And I personally believe that that framework, if it's implemented correctly, we can have a synergy between the young and the old, and a proper contextualization, knowledge coming possibly from the young as they're going out to study and return, or even from the elders because they've studied and they've returned, and understanding how to apply that knowledge in an actualized way, not the abstract understanding that we had in the younger stages that we're at, in order to grow, in order to develop, in order to build institutions, and to ensure that unity and cohesiveness is there, because we're respecting the two dynamics, one at the beginning stage and elders being at a more advanced stage and coming together. That didn't happen necessarily in Brixton in its totality, and we did not afford the respect to the elders, I believe, as we should have done. Had I known about the framework and developed it at that point, I would have implemented it as chairman to ensure that that cohesiveness was there. So I'm going to pass that on to you and get your thoughts on that. But just to see, because you may want to answer this, Brother Hamad Hassan asking, can you comment on a viable way to bring Sunnah currency back into the Ummah, and how as professionals we can take the first steps? I hope, Hamad, in hearing what I've indicated at this particular point, it's pointing in that direction. Yes, you've asked because economics is one of the main binders of a community. Yes, we will touch upon that. So Khalid, over to you.
No, I think absolutely the more successful models and in our communities are those that did blend and win, as we like to say. You know, they had the blend and win, where you have the experience and knowledge and what have you, and the know-how of the elders, with the zeal and the, sometimes it might be Islamic knowledge, because some of those communities had brothers who established things, who have a lot of experience, but they may not have had the Islamic training and the knowledge. And then you have youth that come back and have Islamic knowledge. So the more successful models that we might find in some of the communities, we find some of those communities, I think here in America, we do in on the East Coast, in places like Philly and places like this, some of those communities that they do have that blend, and that blend of experience and knowledge. I think that's imperative. You have to use all the tools of your community in order to build and establish. But something that I want to kind of touch on, as far as what we need to establish, what we need to do in these resilient communities is, and we've talked about this before, and of course we have a lot of masajid, but we do need more masajid, but just not all in the same area. We don't need another masjid on the same block or in the same neighborhood, more or less. We do need to expand and go out and be active in dawah. So we do need to be, I think one thing is have an active dawah program, which perhaps in the past is something we did have, especially I would say this was kind of the focus of a lot of more revert communities generally when we were coming up and so forth, that there was a little bit more energy put into giving dawah. Okay, although we didn't have the infrastructure, but we just gave dawah in the streets, pamphlets, buses, whatever, wherever it was. And as you guys have the dawah in the park there in Hydesbury Park or whatever it is, Hydes Park. So yeah, so that dawah engagement with the community, that's very, very important, and that's a part of our community building and our infrastructure. Also, centers for learning. We need to become a little more serious about talib al-ilm, plain and simple. There are those who go out, but people don't really, I think a lot of, at least what I'm seeing, a lot of the average Muslims in general here, but I can only speak about this area or what have you, but most of the people are not that, they're busy with the dunya and they're not seeing the complete value of seeking Islamic knowledge. Okay. So I think that's a very important pillar that we can never abandon in reviving our communities, and keeping the masajid alive.
I'm going to push back on you there, Khalid, because I appreciate that, and I agree about the knowledge and everything.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead really quickly, and I'm going to finish. Yeah.
As Hamad had indicated, that's one of the things that I feel you'll see many of the youth in today's age will say, and we would say not everyone is talib al-ilm, and there needs to be that focus on building businesses. That the what Hamad has asked about, the sunnah currency. So what we see it more in America, we see it now in the UK, but more amongst maybe the South Asian communities in making sure that the Muslim pound, the Muslim dollar is coming back into those communities, and businesses are being supported by the Muslims. Malcolm X, Malik Shabazz, rahimahullah, made it really clear where he said, look in our communities and you see that you've got everyone from other ethnicities, the Chinese, the Koreans, and everyone. They've got their shops in the black community. And what happens when they've bought this and they're selling substandard products as well, but because the black communities don't have their own stores and everything, they go in there and they're spending their dollar in these stores. And the South Koreans and the Chinese and those Asians who are in those black communities with their stores, when they lock up shop in the evening, they don't live in those communities. They take that money and everything outside. Walaikum Salam reactionary. They take that money outside of the community, and that community therefore stays broke. Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X spoke about that so eloquently. So while I agree, there needs to be those who are doing talab al-ilm. I appreciate that, but to have that expectation, or that everyone is going to be seeking knowledge and that's going to be their priority, that's just not a reality, even in the Muslim world. When we look
I'm with you. I think so. That's why I want to finish my statement and say this. So and actually, I'm going to push back on what you just said, because I see that as more relevant for as the black community and those things. I don't see as relevant as Muslims, because I don't see that at all in. Maybe that's in a where we are revert, maybe in those revert communities, but here where I'm in Washington State, predominantly like 80%, I would say, is migrant. From migrant communities from Somalia. We have one of the biggest Somali diasporas in America. After Minnesota, I think. We have also a huge Indo-Pakistani community, and that tends to be a wealthy, educated class. They live over on this side of the water. They don't have problems with their dollars. Their dollars are the Somalis. They support their restaurants. They support their halal stores. They support the things based on their tribe. So it's really for them, I would say it isn't those, although we all need economic development, but it isn't that problem. That's not the problem we're seeing compared to the African-American community that's non-Muslim, there is that, and the community is kind of almost, those areas have been gentrified and almost non-existent in the Seattle area. That's the government's involved in everything in trying to preserve those cultures, those district that were kind of minority district and also African American communities predominantly, they're devastated, and now that's a whole nother thing. Those, I see that as an issue that they deal with. Us as Muslims, at least here, we don't really deal with that because the money, you know, the people, except for the challenges of corporate, you know, they're providing corporate halal meat. Now, you know, there's so many Muslims here, so you can go to many grocery stores and big places and get bulk meat, and the Muslim restaurants get their meat that way, some of them, and so forth. So we're not having those same economic challenges. What I'm saying is not everyone's going overseas and studying, but absolutely, as a Muslim, as Sheikh Muhammad articulated, he said, "Innahu yajibu alayna ta'allam arba'a masail al-ula ilm." He said, verily, it's an obligation upon us to study 4 things, and the first thing is knowledge. And then he defined that knowledge. He said, "Al-ula al-ilm wa huwa ma'rifatullah, ma'rifat an-nabi, ma'rifat din al-Islam bi adillah." It is knowing Allah, it is knowing His Prophet, and it's knowing the religion of Islam with textual proofs. That's what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that essential knowledge that you as a Muslim, you cannot continue to be a taxi driver, an Uber driver, a businessman, and not know something about your deen. I'm just talking about that. So that's what I mean, is having life to the masajid. We don't want the masajid like the churches. We have a lot of masajid, some of them in certain places in America that don't, they're only open for Jumu'ah. That's it. So they're just like the churches that are open on Sunday. They come together for Jumu'ah. There's no salats during the week there. And then so it only goes to you know, just as relevant, you're obviously not going to have Islamic knowledge being transferred. So the people, subhanAllah, when you see the level of the Muslims in general around the questions, the things I come across daily from my Muslim colleagues that I interact with, so many, and some of the statements, you know, subhanAllah, and from around the world, you know, oh, you know, Jews and Christians, no, but how can we make takfir of them if, you know, this, you know, some of the doubts that the average Muslim has about Islam, it shows us that never, ever can we cease to have that importance just because 5 or 10 people, and that's a big thing, go away to study from a particular masjid. Still, the effect of that is very few. Only so many of those are successful and can come back and do dawah. You know, it's having very little effect. And even some of the, I've noticed here in Washington, some of these big masajid and stuff, still, they're not on fire with durus. There's hard, you know, there's yes, we're having the Sunday tafsir class, we're having this, and that's beautiful. But these places for success, I believe, should be, you know, with durus. There needs to be, if I was an imam, I would be talking on my microphone every salat, as I saw in Yemen, as I witnessed in other places, that this is what revives and keeps the community alive. Not everyone, people can go, it doesn't matter. People have to work, they have to think, but if a few people benefit, you're keeping your masjid alive, and you're keeping your community alive, and the love for knowledge. I did a khutbah, Jumu'ah, in a masjid here, and then I had different people come up to me after the khutbah, and there was one Afghani community, and then they said to me, they asked about, you know, what durus, when are the classes or something, and so then I reverted it to the mueddin because I don't even live in that community, and it's closer to my job, and I was asked to do the khutbah. So I said, well, the mueddin, he would know, and so then they mentioned, and alhamdulillah, they have a few little classes here and there, yes, every Sunday, and then during the week we have this and this, and that's great. But we have no shortage of a need to make these communities vibrant. And if you want to reach the youth, then giving some of those youth something to cling to. Most of the youth are not going to pay attention to that. But if there's a few seeds, maybe from those seeds, they will be the ones who will go back to deal with those other guys who are in the gangs and who are, you know, dealing with other issues. So I believe the knowledge component, not everyone being a major student of knowledge or this and that and the other, aspiring to be a scholar, but that the communities, the life of a Muslim community, that it's based on, you know, I'm sorry, that the masjid especially is based and built on knowledge. Because if you have that absence of knowledge, and we have all these community centers and counseling and this and business programs and stuff, that doesn't mean anything for our Islam ultimately. You know what I mean? It's not a correction of the progressives. I'm sure could establish many vibrant, if we allowed some of those professional progressive people with great skills and societal can maneuver. And wow, the mayor's coming to the masjid today, and you know, and we're just having this kumbaya and this and that and the other. We're going to do this new business cooperation thing, and we're going to build these big institutions, but there's no Islamic knowledge, and there's no sound aqidah, and there's no, you know what I mean? So I think it's that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree.
So so that's what I'm saying. And the last point is that yes, we need those business ventures, and every community is going to be different of what they need. But one thing I see commonly with the wealthier communities and the poorer communities is the need for counseling, marriage counseling, mental health counseling. And one of the things I wrote down would be well-being as far as even physical. How many youth, they want to go to the gym, they want to get swole. Okay, no problem. We love that. But they to have a Muslim fitness center so that the sisters could go and exercise, those who are oriented towards that. And the men can go safely without worrying about, falling into haram and seeing all those things and listening to all the things that you're going to be in the regular gym environment. So having those things as well, and alternatives to the societal norms, and that comes through those institutional buildings. So I think we're on the same page there, but I just wanted to emphasize that point and why I see that's a core thing, because I don't see that. I haven't seen that since I've been in the West. And of course, I haven't traveled to a lot of different places in the West, but I just don't hear about, and I hear people all the time asking me questions from the UK and other places saying, hey, in my local masjid, and we don't have this, and know that the sheikhs don't want to give you time. They don't want to answer your questions. They don't this. So I'm wondering what's going on. We should have vibrant, on fire, knowledge-based communities.
Yeah, no, we are definitely on the same page about that, and I'm glad. Thank you for that clarity. I wanted to push back just to open up that discussion a bit more. But I think what you're saying, yes, that has to be the core, as you said, the key word. It has to be the core. It has to be the foundation. It has to be the platform. I believe that what has to happen, the more orthodox communities like our own. What's unfortunate, Khalid, and I will say this, we've seen, and you know this as well, some of those who studied abroad, they come back and they preach to those who are already where they're at, okay? They preach to those where they're, that's not what we, that's the first thing. It be wider. Also, the masjid, all of those activities that you've highlighted, they should be emanating from the masjid, okay? Some of our masajid, Salafi masajid, other masajid, were doing this. Even you'd have the halal butchers attached to the masjid, the abaya and stove shops attached to the masjid. But we've got to ensure that everything that we're doing in that instance is at a level of professionalism. When I say professionalism, some people think, oh, here we go, talking about professionalism, imitating the kuffar. No, because we know that Allah khatabala ihsan ala kulli shay. Okay, Allah loves perfection in everything. We know the commencement of that hadith in that regard there. But what we see sometimes is a subpar, substandard quality when Muslims are dealing with Muslims. And we need to change that, because that's not an attractive thing from those who are looking in from outside and considering the religion and considering the Muslims in that respect there. You'll have from the more orthodox communities as well, that I think it's just okay, and I will put it out there. We had it in our community. If I'm selling incense, giving dawah part of the time, and selling thobes, then that's success. Okay, within a microcosmic aspect, that may be the case. That may be the case. But on a macro for the community, how is that helping? If everyone's aspirations are at that level, and they say, well, this is how the Sahaba worked. No, if we put the context of the Sahaba, they built their society. They built their communities and then the society. And this is what is required in the aspirations with regards to learning the deen. As you know, when we look at Bukhari and we look at the books, the kitabs that he starts with Tawheed. We know that it starts with Tawheed and the Salah, and then it moves on to prayer. There's an order to Imam Bukhari's chapters, and the Mufassirin, the Muhaddithin, explain that logic in how to progress, how an individual grows and develops with regards to Aqidah, then the Salah, then understanding the fiqh, and then understanding the fiqh of buyu and all of these aspects in that regard. that does need to be implemented. So speaking back to your point about the foundational aspects of the masjid needs to be knowledge. That taxi driver who's driving, the businessman who's doing business, are those classes going on or are they available? But also the communities and the teachers have to go out into their communities. They have to be involved in the schools. They have to be involved in the businesses. If they have a surgery, for example, on the Jummah for businessmen who I'll find out when they have a time that they want to come and have some sessions and everything. That's not taking place. We need to be having, the schools need a lot of attention now because we're building tomorrow's future. So I agree with you in all of these particular aspects here, but I see an insularity and a lack of ambition. And I'm talking about socio-religious ambition. I'd hear me using the term socio-religious, socio-economic, because if it's just religious, religion is within a context, various contexts, societal, you name it, community in this regard. And I think that we are lacking. And those of us who've come from abroad and have seen the context, those who've come from the Indo-Pac subcontinent and have seen how the societies have flourished, what are we bringing into the Western society to replicate tailored models of what we know works religiously? And in some instances, we can make them work even better in the societies here because of the capitalistic structure, because of the democratic thing that allows you, or process that allows you to establish businesses and grow your faith in, to a certain extent, admittedly, where you need to grow. So look, Khalid, this is a really big topic. And I do want to still go and discuss aspects of the framework and what can improve using that framework to guide and navigate communities through society and growth and development and resilience, and also looking at when it can go wrong. And what do I mean by that? I know we're going to have to conclude because of my group and come back into it. But the point that I wanted to make is you've heard me talk about the foundational first stage. A lot of the communities that we see, especially the more culturally heritage based communities, that we've got a lot of the elders who may be in their context at that fourth stage, that mature stage from a point of experience, from a point of culture, from a point of living. And you'll see that age top heavy community does not open any leeway for the youth who are coming in at that founding stage. In fact, they will scorn them, they will frown upon them. And then that means you'll find that those youth do not have those avenues open to them to contribute their talents, their growth, their ideas and exuberance into those communities. And we see that in a lot of the cultural communities, but I dare say that's happening in our communities, the Salafi communities now, with those who've been around from the 90s, the 80s, 90s, noughties, not wanting the others to come in, not understanding the social media world that's actually there. And in blocking these younger individuals, they ostracize them. In the same way that the younger individuals who came in, like we did, ostracized the elders for not having studied, not having knowledge, and you have that rictus gap, that vacuum forming in that instance. And I'm going to hand it over to you so we can conclude, but with a pause on that so we can continue with this very important discussion the next time we come around. So over to you, my brother.
Inshallah ta'ala. Now, so I think at least what I'm seeing, and again, I'd say I'm still kind of distant, but it seems to me that there is some of that bridging of the gap from, and I'm looking externally because the only model I have is kind of what I'm getting accustomed to here in the Seattle, Washington State general area. But I think there is some of that bridging of the gap in some of the communities, but the communities, again, that I'm looking at here, they're all migrant, top heavy, migrant governed. You know, you're not going to be a board member of any of the Somali masajid. They are Somali, you know, and they are from particular tribes, the Ethiopians, the Amharas, the Tigray, Oromo. You know, these communities here are, they're kind of divided and everybody's doing the Gambians. They have their own place. So they have their own model and even their own set of issues, I would say. And what I see is as reverts, we're sprinkled around. So there's things that we commonly face here in these societies, as we've been talking about, the institutional building, the transference of knowledge. But I'm also seeing a lot. There's a lot of. I'm really surprised because the organization I'm working for now, it's a Somali organization, nonprofit. I see the East Africans in general. They have East African organizations. They have Somali organizations, Ethiopian organizations. So the people are doing. They are building and they're networking, and you're seeing people in working for the government here a lot, not as like mayoral candidates or anything like this, but they're working in government and social services and stuff like that. So you can see a lot of people, they're pushing to educate their youth. They're, there's a different impact on the society, but they still have kind of their, everybody's looking for the piece of pie for their community, so there's those challenges. So I'm not sure, there's a lot of complexities, but the things that we commonly face is we are losing our youth a lot. And again, I'm saying going back to educating in the communities, strong education. Parents need to be parenting on a level like they never have before. Like I said before, we could watch TV all day and play and this and that and the other in the street, and hopefully do some of our homework as well, and we could kind of get by. But these days, just the device alone, and even if they're A students and they're successful in the school, but they can have horrendous manners. They may even memorize the Quran or a significant part of the Quran, but they are just because of what they're bombarded with in the public schools and in the society and the pressures and so forth, and the areas they grow up in, they are, we're losing a lot of our youth. It'll either be through a loss of identity or through, it could be through violence. It could be through drugs. We just have a plethora of problems and issues that we're dealing with, which I think is unprecedented, for just the way the change in the world and technology and the access to things, here with the legalization of marijuana and stuff like this, many places here, the legal and even in
Right, you've frozen on us, Khalid. I don't know if you can hear me as I'm speaking. Shireen,
drugs in general in certain cities that are not far from us.
You
yeah, looks like there was a quick breakdown there. Yeah, am I back on now?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. So there's anyway, we're dealing with a whole plethora of problems and issues, which are much bigger than the scope of what we can discuss and so forth, and even solutions. They're complex, require complex approaches. But I think a big thing is parenting is not like it was in the past, and the need for being 100% hands-on for people now raising children is even more critical. Monitoring the devices of your children, how much time they're allowed, teaching them to speak to their parents, things that we would have got smacked for and knocked all of our teeth. We would have been looking for our teeth around the room for just looking at our parents this way. Parents now are literally running their parents. And I heard of a particular woman, a young woman, she's, a young girl, 16 or whatever, running her mother from a particular migrant community, which I was like, what? And she's like, telling her mother what to do. And I don't want to do this. And I'm not going, okay. And the mother cowing to the daughter. So as we see from the hadith of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the hadith of Jibreel talking about the slave girl will, the hadith anyhow. So in the hadith of Jibreel. And so we've seen this. We're seeing the decline of authority. Just issue after issue, and drugs and all the things that we're facing. So we have a lot of complexities to deal with, and we do need those institutions and the religious foundations and raising our parents, raising our communities and our parenting, and so many things that we need to do in order to sustain, or we will lose a lot of our youth, and a lot of people will leave Islam, as well as people will come to Islam. And this is just the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. But we'll just do the best that we can to preserve our families and our children and our societies to the best of our ability.
No, Jazakallah khair.
And I'll close on that.
What we'll do, I think there's a lot to continue on from here, and there's some very good suggestions and recommendations, observations. As you were talking about youth, the recommendation about youth initiatives and centres. Shirin was saying as well about the what should be done localized to address some of these issues. So I think that brothers and sisters, the next session is going to be earlier, at an earlier time, probably half an hour earlier or so, just so we can really cover the topic at hand. We're ending at this point because I have to go for prayer. It's the time for me now, mashallah, tabarakallah. And we will return to this, continuing with this, a part 2, to go into more detail. I think we need to discuss this. The challenges that we're facing, Dr. Khalid, Brother Khalid has highlighted some of them. Especially around the youth at the moment, especially around parenting, especially around the lack of knowledge, the basic lack of knowledge that's there prevalent amongst our communities. And with all these factors and dynamics, it doesn't bode well unless we halt the tide that is against us and start moving with the factors and the knowledge that we know communities were built upon. And we have the prophetic model, and that would always be the model to look at and to develop upon. So with that, we will conclude until we return. I'm going to have a discussion with Dr. Khalid and Brother Hassan, Stream Islam, to see if we should return next week, because this is fresh and a hot topic that needs to be addressed with some urgency, I would say. And so we'll let you know if we can return next week, if our brothers are available for that. So I will end at this point to catch the prayer, inshallah.
Yeah. The last thing I just want to say is, maybe in the comments, if people have ideas for topics or things that they would be interested in us exploring as well, then that also would be something could be useful for us in also choosing topics to go forward as well, inshallah ta'ala.
Yeah, with that's answer. We're going to deal with that next week if we can. So Brother Hassan, if you can retain the conversation today, and we look forward to seeing you, if not next week, the week after, but we're going to discuss if we can see you next week, inshallah.
And if it's possible, I mean, if you need to go, I can try to deal with this question.
I would do, I would leave and try and come back onto this if you're still going to be here. That may be a way forward. So
yeah, I don't think I'll be too much longer, but yeah, I could just try to deal with this question, inshallah ta'ala.
I will say salams to everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Jazakumullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Barakallah feek. Jazakallah khairan, doctor. Naam. So there was a question: to what degree is it the parents' fault? Wouldn't they have had to do something for Allah to have their kids rebel and insult them? So this can be one of the reasons for having your children rebel against you. And as the Salaf, they used to mention about basically, like, if a man sees that his riding animal, for example, in those times, a camel or his donkey or his horse or what have you, is being disobedient, and his wife is not listening to him or something like this, he has to look at his sins. This is how the Salaf used to look at it. So obviously we know from the Quran and the Sunnah that many of our problems and issues, that it comes from our own sins. And a lot of even the spread of sickness and disease and many things and trials and tribulations we find throughout the world, a lot of it comes down to sins. And I was just listening to one of the scholars mentioning about this in detail, Sheikh Uthman al-Thamari, hafidhullah ta'ala. So that could be one thing to look at. Another thing also to consider is you are not guaranteed, no matter how much you try, to raise your children. And that's why, you have so many mothers and fathers who spend their wealth and their time trying to get their children to memorize the Quran and be in an Islamic school. And the children still rebel and they become disastrous. So I think one of the things that I'm looking at, and I think is very critical, is that the parents, and I had an interesting discussion with a brother about this, but anyhow, the parents need that proactive role in raising their children through that whole journey of childhood, of teaching them manners. Because a lot of times when you look at television shows, even cartoons, the children, the manners that the cartoons are teaching them, for example, SpongeBob or whoever it may be, you can see it reflected in your children and how they talk to you. Like even the way their behavior and how their language they use, they're being influenced so much by those cartoons. And so as a parent, even that has to be monitored, and that has to be tapered in how you sit down with your child or children and say, hey, no, you can't talk to us like that. No, you should not, speak to your elders like that, even though you saw that in the cartoon. So those things have to, it's a very active job. And another benefit that I learned from one of the brothers that I had, he came on my YouTube, one of my neighbors, and he was speaking about the myth of being a teenager. And he was just talking about the importance of that there should not be Islamically a stage where, and in the past it didn't exist, the concept of being a teenager, meaning, oh, it's a teenager, they rebel at this stage. Oh, he's a teenager, she's a teenager, she has to have this leeway, we should allow for her to do some of these things now. No, these are concepts that even in these non-Muslim societies didn't exist in the past. Rather, in the past, for Muslims and non-Muslims, you got to a certain age and you were learning skills. Your parents, if you're into coding, if you're a computer tech guy, why not teach your children, have them sit with you sometimes when you have a lower workload to teach them those skills. If you're a businessman, teach your child. And that's one of the things I notice in being in places like Yemen. You'll see young kids running the store, even in Ethiopia, young kids running their father's store. Sometimes their father's at the salat, or their father's had to do this. And the young boys, they're learning those skills. They're learning how to deal with money. They're learning how. So I think it's very important as a parent to increase the responsibility of the children. If they learn a sense of responsibility and they learn some morality and manners and Islamic adab, that will busy them to keep them away from just hanging out with people who have very little benefit for them and who have destructive language and destructive manners and so forth. Because you see it now with these kids that are like, unfortunately, that are like from 10 on to 18 and stuff, like some of the horrendous manners. And some of these are the better children. These are the ones who have memorized the Quran, and these are the ones who have Muslim parents and have that, even have religious parents, but they just can't compete with what they're being bombarded with in the society and what they're watching in the Marvel movies and what they're watching here and there and the rappers that they're listening to and everything else. So you have to control the input of what your children are being given, and you have to take a very active role. Otherwise, the society will raise your children and destroy your children. Wallahu musta'an. And this is just a cold reality of what we're witnessing right now. Wallahu musta'an. So hopefully that gave you some insight into that. Yes, it could be a trial which raises the status of the parent. Absolutely. But honestly, if we're looking at it as well, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates a sabab. He creates a reason as well, that there are shortcomings, because usually that is not the case when you have that more complete environment. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect in Saudi Arabia and some of these countries, but if you look at a lot of the Muslim countries in the traditional societies, even if it's Pakistan, even if it's, and even though I don't have a lot of experience in it, I've never been to Pakistan and stuff, but generally those traditional societies, they have some strong, the whole environment to where they know how to deal with elders. They serve, like you go to Saudi Arabia and it's in a lot of the places, if you're in a gathering, the young boys will come in and they will serve the older adults on trays. They'll sit and they'll stand with the tea and the coffee. If you look at our societies, if I go to an American, a Muslim household here in America, whether it's Somali, whether it's whatever their society, yeah, some of them retain some of those traditional things. But a lot of these kids, they won't even, the kid will come in, hey, what's up? Oh, yeah. Oh, this is so-and-so. So what's going on? They don't have the same manners and adab that you would have when your society and when you have those traditional values inculcated in you as an individual. So yes, it could be the test, But mostly, I think, even with the test, there's also reasons. There's reasons because everyone is tested, but you don't see the chaos in a lot of those societies. If you're in Saudi Arabia or something like this, you're not going to see that because the whole society and the whole tribe and the whole, you know, and as they say is an African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. So you have those things. If you're coming from Uganda, if you're coming from a lot of these places, they still have that type of morality, Muslim and non-Muslim. They have a lot of those concepts which help to govern the behavior of the children. But when you have the whole society against you and you're giving your children so much leeway, oh, just let them watch all these cartoons for 6 and 7 hours. It's okay every day. And then the weekend. And there's no monitoring and there's no, you know, what do you expect? They're learning the morality of SpongeBob and whoever else and whatever, and how to talk and communicate with people in the way that they do on there. If you just go just for a minute, sometimes I'm in a room and they're watching TV and you can hear, you don't even have to be in the room, and you hear the things on a regular light show that's built for teens or whatever, and just all the things which are considered munkar that are being spread, and you're hearing it. It's kind of amazing, which is so different than when we grew up, the types of television, you know, a lot of the shows, and I mentioned this even during the khutbah, that a lot of the things that we were raised up on shows, like, even though it was before our time, but it was still being on the television, like Andy Griffith, the Andy Griffith Show. Most of you don't even know anything about that, I'm sure, and all these kind of shows, which were family shows, family comedies. They were sitcoms and stuff, but they were like about small towns. And you can hear in those shows, they're even talking about religion so much. You know, they'll have scenes, they're in the church, and they're, you know, they really, morality was very much, and this is American non-Muslim television from the 50s, from the 60s. Very different reality than what even the average Disney show shows. Everything now as a joke. And then, you know, everything's got to push LGBTQ values, and everything's got, you know, your children are bombarded with something which I think has never been known in the history of man. So as parents, you have it's not like before. It's not even sufficient what others did before you. What you have to really be a part of that whole process. And there's really so much to say about that, but may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us and help our children and our families. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Now, if there are no other questions, and inshallah ta'ala, then we will move on, and we just say Jazakallah khair for joining us at the Doctor's Lab, and hopefully we can have some more beneficial discussions and meetings going forward. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hayyakum Allah. Barakallah feekum.